Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to All Things Division 3 Soccer with Simple Coach and Jackie. I, as you may or may not know, am a Simple Coach, and that there, as I'm sure you know, is Jackie, sleeping away. So before I get into this episode of Injured Time on Pay to Play, I just wanted to make a quick announcement. The bunch of folks have asked how they could help support the channel, so I just created this, I guess, a Patreon Patreon page where you could subscribe. I'll plan on doing special things for those of you. It was just sort of quick setup. So below you can find it, All Things Division 3 Soccer. Any support you can give would be great. I have plans to, do a bunch of different things, so any help you could offer is greatly appreciated. So now on to the main topic. All right, so yes, it's a new episode of Injured Time, and yes, I have decided to do, or you all have decided to have me do an episode on the dreaded pay-to-play system here in the U.S. It's probably something I have been actively thinking about, probably for the last 12 years, largely because of my own simple players participating in club soccer. For a very competitive, elite, super great club, which costs a lot. And, got costlier as simple player number 1 joined, and then simple player number 2, and then now simple player number 3, who's part of that club. And, so I'm probably, like many of you, the prime example of how it hurts, how the pay-to-play model hurts. I know it every year, so I would chalk up my experience to writing the checks. But I will say that the topic has me torn a bit. I don't begrudge people for making a living. I don't begrudge people charging for services, no matter what they are. Like if somebody's willing to pay, they're willing to pay. And do I think there's a lot of structural issues around club soccer that might be more worthy of attention rather than thinking about how it's paid for? Because I honestly, I don't see any changes coming down, or the ability to change the current structure. So with that, let's jump right into it. Okay, as I've been doing in the last episodes of Injured Time, for the most part, except for my Women's World Cup ones, I put a poll out on Twitter, and you all chose the dreaded pay-to-play. So, that topic had the most votes, sadly. But if you're here, you're watching, you don't know what pay-to-play is, you're either your Wi-Fi in the cave that you live in, or in a remote off the grid cabin in Alaska. This is sort of what I dug up. Just very broadly, it's having to pay for your player to play on a team, and that there's some sort of fee or fees, or however it's structured. Basically, you got to shell out cash for your kid to play. But according to to Braves, the browser of choice, summarizer, this is what I got. The pay-to-play soccer system in the U.S. requires players to pay a fee to play for a team that is competitive in nature. I'm going to go on and sort of the average cost of a year of soccer in the U.S. is $1,472. I wish, but elite clubs can cost over $10,000. Critics argue that the system excludes children from lower income families, regardless of their talent. The system can refer to paying to join a team or league, or to pay for access to soccer facilities. The average cost of a year of soccer in the U.S. is $20,000, which is higher than the average cost of $1,472 in European countries. Yeah, lot to unpack there, and again, I'm just taking numbers at face value. Like my biggest issue probably, and it'll come through, and I'll talk a little bit about a poll I did, is that I think it's almost like this. It's not a straw man, but this thing out there that people just sort of gravitate to explain in a simple form deficiencies that they see in the system, right? In club soccer, youth development, what have you. But fundamentally, I don't think we have the information necessary to draw those conclusions, right? Like the one I always say, like, well, if who's being left out of a pay-to-play system, and I'm sure there's kids are. I show data, well, that may indicate as much, but is that population, that group of players who can't play because of cost? I mean, is that the sole driver? Is it that they just don't want to play? I mean, there's a whole set stuff to unpack there. So I'm gonna try to dive into a little bit of that and sort of give you my interpretation of things. Again, it's maybe a little. I try to look at things a little differently, just because I find a lot of arguments these days in the world of soccer to be unimaginative and sort of hard-coded. So I try to break away from that. But, I'm not sure. I think history is a valuable teacher here, and I'm not sure I have the history down as to when we started becoming this, this big pay-to-play model. I would suspect it started in the, in the 90s. I'm guessing, like where I think there were players, coaches who started making a living or wanted to make a living doing soccer. So I think the first things you started to see were soccer camps and how much money could be made there. And then you had the advent of all the leagues and, U.S. club soccer and, ECNL and these different organizations that tried to amp up existing soccer structures and nationalize and regionalize things, and, teams to succeed started to invest more in getting full-time coaches, and then the facilities started to amp up, and it was important for clubs to have their own places to play. And I think as you think about this, the cost of running a club ended up sort of escalating, and how clubs do it. They don't really raise money for the most part. They may raise some, but the bulk of where they're going to get their money from is having fees or dues that are paid to the club. So I think it's just a natural progression of it. And then obviously at some point now we're just so professionalized in the soccer world. Again, we are where we are. So I'm sure I can get some disagreements, right? Like, and people say something different. But what's interesting is I really do think that, I'll just say the late 80s to the 90s is where U.S. soccer really came into its own. And I know the history of U.S. soccer dating back Bethlehem Steel and way back, but I don't think really soccer became a cultural issue or a cultural thing until that time frame. And again, I think the youth soccer scene really drove that, and then MLS and the World Cups, and sort of that started to, and dare I say, access to games on TV just really started to amp that up. And so it's interesting. I find the discussion of pay to play as like discussing original sin, if you're into faith and things like that, right? Like, it's like the first thing that was done that was bad, and it sort of corrupted the system since. And so to discuss pay to play, you have to talk about original sin, and how do you go back and unwind that? You can't, right? Like, it's just, I just think it's the nature of the beast, and I think the worst thing we do is compare our pay to play system to obviously the great soccer powers and how they develop players, and without understanding there's a completely different way in which youth soccer developed, and how this all came about, and why there isn't necessarily a pay to play system, or why they have the fields and the facilities and that sort of thing that we just never had. And so we had to build, and that costs money. And so for this injured time, for this episode, I'm going to break it into a bunch of different segments, and some of it might be rambling, but it makes complete sense in my own head. But I do think it's informative, and I just don't think it talks about some of the things when we discuss pay to play. So I think first I'm going to talk about just sort of the overall commitment a player makes from a financial standpoint and the burden they have to bear. And I'll give you a real life example, my own. I'll just show you numbers from a few years ago where I watch it, and it's only gotten worse. So, or more severe. Then I do want to talk about covering the cost of a club, right? That's not insubstantial. And then I'll sort of talk about a little bit on a macro level, what that looked like. And then maybe at the end, I'll just sort of talk about, again, where we are. I mean, how do I think we make it better? Or how do we lessen the financial burden? And I have some distinct ideas about that. But again, these are ideas of my own. So, so let's jump into the first part, where what's the financial commitment or the financial burdens of a player. So that it's not confusing, or it probably is, but it's not. I'm not forgetting things, and I'm laying it out as best I can. When it comes to the pay part of pay to play, let's stipulate some of the realities in soccer, and probably, dare I say, in youth sports in general, right? Because, hey, if soccer's too expensive, go play basketball, right? Or baseball, or like there's an increasing professionalization of those youth sports, and just because of that, right? So but the reality is that in any of these sports, the club fees is not your only expense, right? You might be paying $1,000 a year, but there's a ton of other costs that come with it, right? Like the obvious ones: game uniforms, training gear, cleats, travel expenses, tournament expenses, fundraising commitments, right? Like, hey, you're obligated to raise $100 per player in our latest donut sale. And so, right, do you kick in the $100, or you actually go fund? You get my point. But so, right. So there's a bunch of components to it, and I was trying to think about, hey, real life examples, and how could I get real life examples? And the truth is I've been dealing with this, like I mentioned, for 12 years. So it just interestingly enough, in 2018, I actually did an exercise where I tracked all of my expenses for the simple players, right? The 3 simple players that I have that were playing at that club at the same time. And just to give you some perspective, at that time, you're looking at probably a U16, a U13, and maybe like a U9. I'm going to guess. No, probably like a U10. So, like, those 3 categories. All right, so I'm just sharing my screen here for you because to show you the expenses that I tracked. Now, keep in mind, I think this is a low estimate because there's a lot of stuff I didn't really include, and I just sort of, as things would happen, and then again, as I was done, I was guesstimating, and in 2018, conservatively, I spent $22,000, $244 on the 3 simple players, number 1, 2, and 3, to play soccer. So let's just, you could look on the left here. I think my arrow should be working for you right here. Like right on this. This is simple player number 1, who just so happens to be my oldest. So tuition was $3,100 for the year. All right. That year he did some ODP training, which was $200. I guesstimated there were 10 travel games in a given year. So I was like, between gas and food, and I was like, it'll just be like $100 or, $110 per. So I just put, per trip. And because we go, right? We don't go to, we might have a game in Jersey, but then we would also have a game in Maryland or Connecticut. And so we're driving all over the place. So, he played middle school soccer for $100. There was a tryout fee. There were cleats. There were uniforms. It was a great experience, but we spent an entire week in Huntington, West Virginia for the regionals for like the entire week. Like it was one game a day, and you stayed in a hotel. And we were in a hotel. And look, love Huntington. I think it's a great little town, but when you're sort of like a tourist, there's not a whole heck of a lot to do after the first day. Then it's just, so many painted pictures, painted little cabooses that you can see, because they have these train. It's like, you can see the painted cows. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there they have trains that are like this big steel, and they're painted in different mosaics and stuff like that. It is actually pretty cool, but so many you can see, right? So I estimated that was $2,000 right there. We went to Dallas, which was fun as well, but that's costly. And then we did another tournament, relatively local. There was some group training indoor, and then we did another tournament. And then again, that was just maybe an overnight, which probably tells me that was somewhere in PA, right? And that was $11,000. That was the bulk of it, right? Because he was this is probably like U15-ish, maybe 14. So it's on the younger side, and on the older side, I know that they definitely traveled as he got older. Simple player number 2, same exercise. Did a beach tournament for him. His tuition, ODP, uniforms, group training, more tournaments. And then simple player number 3, You could see here his tuition, $2,500. 8 travels. This was a little bit easier because, he was, like I said, U9, U10, I can't remember. But he was on the younger side, so they didn't do nearly as much. And they were relatively local. They didn't travel to, crazy places to play. So, and again, I think this is conservative because this was not like me every day, every time I spent a dime. So, could you argue that I spent 30 grand in a year for soccer? Yeah, without a doubt, because like I said, this wasn't an actual itemized list. I wish in hindsight I would have done that, but not the case. So again, I am a case study of pay to play and how it hurts. And that's a lot of money, no matter what, and we participated in it. And there's a number of reasons for it, right? And I'll get to some survey answers questions, but right, there's a competitiveness, quality of player. I mean, there's a whole slew of reasons why you would choose this over your local town team, right? That, again, it drives the competitive spirit a little bit more. It's not... it's a little bit more serious, there's more training. So yeah, I mean, I'm not justifying it right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the choice we made. And I will say that, aside from rec basketball, which was the greatest thing ever, for them, they really didn't do much outside of soccer because who had time, right? So, so that's it. So that's why you could see it takes me a while even to just get lights nowadays. So that's all. This has all been reduced now. I bet you I'll spend 11 grand, 12, 15 grand on simple player number 3, who is now going to be a U16, I believe, right? I'm still going to be paying quite a bit of money here in the upcoming year. But so just wanted to give you a glimpse. One of the other aspects of pay to play that we don't, we only tend to look at the one side of the ledger, right, which is our ledger. But we don't think about what the club expenses are. And so I just wanted to break those out. And I do want to dismiss something. I think most clubs nowadays are 501c3s, right? So they're not for profit. So basically whatever they take in, they dole out, right? And so, they probably don't sit on huge piles of cash. It's basically cash flow management, I think, is where, I'm not an accountant, but I think that's where the big play is here. So, they, for the most part, and this is something I think at some point, maybe some clubs will really broach and really do some serious fundraising development type activities where they raise bulks of money. It's a hard thing to do if it's just for an athletic cause, right? So, I tried to come up with just some sort of generic sort of club, right? I don't have access to books from anybody, so I just sort of decided to make this up as sort of a generic club. So, taking it just as an example, a club with 100 kids are paying $2,000 a piece, assuming there's camps, a little bit of fundraising and sponsorships, and so the club brings in $250,000 in revenue a year. Which would probably mean they probably have that much in expenses, right? If 250 is going in, they're not for profit. 250 is going out to one degree or another. And I'm just saying, this is just a simplistic view of how a club operates. It's not that simple. But let's just stick with that for argument's sake. And if you think about the expenses that the club has, some of it's obvious. Field rentals, Most clubs don't have access to their own proprietary fields, but if they do, there are expenses to that: field management, insurance, all that kind of stuff. Ref fees, they still got to pay the refs. Equipment, balls, cones, pennies, hurdles, ladders, goals. Gets more sophisticated every year, it seems. Sometimes uniforms, I'm sure for the coaches they have to pay. Insurance, all sorts of regulatory things around coaches and kids. Coaching salaries, which is the big one. Like I mentioned, especially if they have their own fields, field management, building or maintaining the facilities, as I mentioned, and then league and tournament fees, which may or may not be included as part of the club fees. And unfortunately, there's very few avenues for a soccer club to pursue raising funds to support those expenses, right? So the obvious ones, like I mentioned, there's the player fees are probably the primary. Creating a tournament, which is why every club has a tournament of some sort or multiple, because that brings in some money to offset the costs. Sponsorships, most clubs have some sponsorship levels. Again, I'm not sure how much that occurs because most clubs don't have a full-time ad person like going out and hustling trying to find sponsors. Same on the fundraising side. They don't have a full-time development officer who can go out and raise money for the club from business and from right. And I do think to a certain extent this is an uncharted area. I don't know how difficult it is to raise fundraising dollars for a sports club that doesn't have some sort of mission, right? Like some sort of higher purpose other than athletics. I do know of one club that is for the inner city that raises all of its funds, and that's different, right? Like the purpose is to get kids off the streets and to play, and to play soccer, whereas a club in an affluent area may just have parents probably just prefer to pay. So anyhow, that's me spouting off a little bit. All right, so now that we get the costs and understand the costs on parent and clubs, I also think something that muddies the waters is the thought, understanding, impression that it's a panacea elsewhere, right? Like you go to England or you go to anywhere in Europe and look, you have all these people who get to play and they're not paying or they're paying very little. I think that's a little bit of a misnomer because you trade one set of issues for a whole other set of issues, right? Granted, maybe you're not paying. Maybe you're not paying as much as you would here in the States, but you're still paying something. Most youth coaches are not full-time coaches, right? Which presents a whole other set of issues for those coaches, right? There's only so much you could do out of your want to help. At some point you have to sort of make your way in life, and if you can't do it coaching, well then you have to go pursue other avenues, right? It's just the reality of that. there, I would argue that something that nobody considers about is that the infrastructure, right, is is basically government largesse, or started out to one degree or another, you know, and it's not, these are not, this is facilities that were placed in places by local governments to one degree or another. Clubs that pooled money 100 years ago, right? We've never had such an experience. And so to expect now that we're going to have this infrastructure that's going to be supported by some state governments equally across the board, I think is a little unrealistic, right? That's why clubs buy and build their own things, is figure out ways to create their own spaces, because what are the football teams going to say when a local government builds a soccer field? Or what's the baseball guy? What are the baseball guys going to say? At some point, then you have to equally distribute, and that just becomes a mess. And I don't think there's much interest, obviously, for doing something like that. Just think reality. I would suggest too that, right, there are some tournaments, don't get me wrong, that to go and play in, but we have a whole tournament industrial complex in the U.S. where you can go anywhere and play in tournaments on any given weekend. As a ref, I already have announcements for tournaments that are happening this weekend, and because there's such big fundraisers, I actually know of someone who has built a whole company around doing tournaments and leagues, EDP, and does them almost every weekend, creates some other tournament. Why? Because they're so profitable. So I think the reality is that we substitute one set of problems for another. Nothing is perfect. Do I wish it was cheaper? Yes. Do I think we're going to get it to zero? No. Can we reduce it? Sure. There's a bunch of things that we could do, but that requires buy-in from the federation, and to a certain extent parents, and so I'll talk a little bit about that next. This is going to be a long one, so I apologize. There's a lot of data and a lot of information out there that to share. So first, I do want to jump in. I started this survey, and it just presented some interesting data that I'm going to share a bit of it now, because it was, I don't know, again, the lack of data to me is surprising. So I'm like, hey, I'm just going to start asking people, and came up with a poll, and you can, I'll put it down in the link below where you can, if you're interested, you could apply, or you can fill it out. It's 10 questions. It's nothing major. So the survey I did. So I put together some quick questions, really not with the express purpose. One of my biggest complaints about a lot of the discussion around pay to play is that we don't really have, I think, really substantial data that proves or disproves good, bad, one way or the other, right? So I don't think we have data that says, well, the pay to play, it might reduce the access, but because people can't afford, which is completely legit. But are there players who are being marginalized who would play otherwise? And I'm not sure about that, right? Because we're talking pay to play about high end level soccer, right? Like, the reality is that this club stuff is the upper end, but there's also cheaper cheaper options to play, right? So there are avenues to play. I mean, even if you just played high school, right? Like that's almost nothing. And I get there's other issues, right? Like someone mentioned transportation. That's a great one I never thought of, right? Like is there a transportation issue, or again a facility issue? And if you're in an inner city somewhere, where's your nearest soccer field that you could play? So but so I started this thing, and so it's only 41 people or 42 people who have responded, but majority of them were parents. All of them, all but one, pay to play, right? And what's interesting is, I think the majority of people in club fees alone play anywhere between, could go as low as $1,000 to as much as $4,000. So there's a good healthy range, and that's just the fees, right? Doesn't include, hey, are you paying for uniforms, footwear? That's another. For a majority, it's anywhere between $250 and $1,000, right? And so that's what you're paying. And travel, I mean, travel's the ridiculous one. People spending as much as $15,000 a year in travel costs, which is the big one. What I thought was interesting, and because I'm curious, right? And this is sort of where I want to dive into a little bit more, and I'm going to expand this as I go, and ask more questions and make it more complete, and just keep collecting information. About half of those, a little bit more than half, know someone who can't play because of the cost. All right, and that's an interesting. That to me is very interesting, because I'd be very curious to explore who are those people who can't play because of cost. Again, not saying they're not right or wrong. I'm just, quite honestly, I didn't expect it to be that high. One of the questions I thought was equally interesting was, I said, you're paying $3,000 a year and all this other expense. Do you have other options to play other than paying this amount? And 80%, 81% roughly, 34 of the respondents said that they had other avenues that would cost less. Right? A lot of them talk about high school soccer and local soccer associations. So the Montgomery Travelers, that's sort of one of them, our local one here. But there were comments about, no lower cost options at level of play needed for pathway to college, right? So they're obviously buying access. Competition is typically lower quality, so have to play up 2 years or so to get better. Clubs in Northwest Ohio are not good pipelines to NCAA. And then the high school soccer. So, I did ask, why don't you move your player to a lower cost option? Some said it's not, a year-long option. Most want to go play in college. Others just commented it's a lower level of play, right? Like, and bigger leagues. I mean, these are the trade-offs you're making, right? In the current model. in the current model. So most of it comes down to, just seems, is this the recruiting and where they recruit, which is what I've said. Like the ECNL and the MLS Next is just a way to pool players for colleges and whoever to concentrate their recruiting. So and so and so I just think it's an interesting look into those, at least those people who have responded, right? That one, they have other options that are cheaper. Two, they look at it as an opportunity to give their player the most exposure and competitive level. And yeah, that there's folks who can't afford to play at these levels. Those are the four main things. And so, which I think is interesting. Again, you have folks who are willing to pay for it's almost like a gamble, right? It's a bet. Like, hey, I'm going to give my kid the best access to play in college, whether they want to or not. It's a different story, but best access for thinking. I don't know why. That's a whole other. I'm not even going to speculate. I can speculate, but I won't. So, all right. So I just wanted to touch on that because I thought that's some interesting things around that. And like I said, the survey's down below, so feel free to answer some more. But I do want to dive into this. So over time, I'm hoping this survey is going to go from 10. I'll just keep expanding. Again, because I'm not sure we have a real deep understanding. We have deep thoughts and ideas, but we don't have an understanding as to some of this stuff. And so I'm always just looking for that. So, all right, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the arguments that are made against pay to play, right? Like, and I do want to say that a lot of academies, the MLS ones, obviously, there is no pay to play model. Those are effectively free, right? Free, right? So, you get signed by one of the MLS academies, or I'm sure there's even clubs that have their MLS teams. Maybe it's not a pay to play model. Maybe it's discounted. I don't know, because the rest of the club supports that. I'm sure there is. I'm just talking about the everyone else, right? Like I don't even think it's an 80-20 rule, but 90% of people who are in the club system end up paying, maybe more, 95%. So I did want to throw that out. One of the big things that everyone talks about are solidarity payments, right? Which is this notion that if a club develops a player and they turn professional, they get a kickback from that professional club for all of the training they've done. Well, right, I think we got a volume issue, right? If we could tomorrow say, hey, solidarity payments for the development of professional players, right? We probably, if you're in England, there's like 1,000 players a year that sign professional contracts, right? So it makes a lot of sense. But in the U.S., you're only churning out 60 professional players a year. Not to mention the general instability of professional soccer in the U.S., excluding MLS, right? Each club financially, anything outside of MLS, and even some MLS clubs, I'm sure, are just, teeter for the most part on, between making money and losing money. So solidarity payments would just add to the burden. And then I would just add, like, there's nothing that can compel any of these clubs to pay, right? To pay a solidarity payment to different clubs. Not to mention the size and scale of it would be enormous to have an impact, right? To have an impact, right? Because you're talking about, I don't know, I'm sure I could do the math somewhere. If there are, I'm sure I've done the math. Hang on. Okay, I did want to clarify something. There are avenues on the higher end too, right? Like where players don't have to pay, right? So it could be, they're part of those MLS academies, right? Where my understanding is that most of those are free, and I'm sure there's other academies out there that those players are free and that they're supported by the fees that everyone else pays who are not on that. So there is that component. One of the things that the big time folks who say, hey, we should institute solidarity payments, which is these clubs, professional clubs kicking money back to amateur clubs as a form of payment for developing players. And the thought is, okay, now we'll just reduce the cost for those clubs to operate. And first of all, I'm sure there's a whole slew of legal issues if the Fed said, hey, everyone's going to be on the hook for solidarity payments. How many lawsuits would they go through? Because you can't compel company necessarily to do anything unless you could do by the force of law, right? So that's one thing, and I don't think clubs are going to agree to it just because. And then, not to mention just the sheer cost, right? This to me is this is like an exercise in replacing economies, right? So currently, you have an economy, a youth soccer economy that is billions of dollars has been created. So you have to figure out a way, if you want to cheapen it, just using solidarity payments, you have to figure out how to get, let's be honest, MLS and maybe USL. I don't know what the limits would be, but to replace those billions of dollars with their own billions of dollars. And I just, to me, that's just unrealistic, like it's just not reality. In order to replicate what was done overseas, we would have to, again, federal governments, state governments, local governments would have to be energized and influenced to basically fork out money every year to support infrastructure and the different aspects, and that's never going to happen, right? Because let's just say in New Jersey that works, but maybe in Pennsylvania it doesn't. So what's Pennsylvania now becomes a wasteland of soccer because no one, right? There's no place, there's no funding, right? And I know I hear people talk about how much money coaches make. I don't know. There's data on that. There's the annual compensation survey, and I think 50%, over 50% live under the poverty line. Like from a pay standpoint, like they don't make more than $30,000, right? Like, I got the graphic up here, like, right? So it's not like these folks are making tremendous amounts of money, So again, a matter of replacing it, and these are full-time guys, right? Like I just think a matter of replacing it just becomes really, really suspect with solidarity payments. That's, again, and I've seen math, and it's reasonable. It's not that you just need to make a commitment. I'm like, world doesn't work that way. And I'm sure MLS would be like, we're not going to spend how much? 100 million, 200 million a year just on giving it away to clubs? Like, sorry, that's not the business they're in. And can the Fed compel them to do that? I'm not sure they can. So, what I will say, and what I think you could do to reduce cost across the board, right, is, and this would kill some organizations. Don't be fooled by it, right? Like this would just sort of end some leagues probably. And the first one is you make everything, you return everything back to the states, right? So the U.S. Soccer Federation says the states now run the now run youth soccer, right? And so they're given this sort of autonomy to develop it as they see fit. And part of that, they would have to, they would have to say, all right, the highest achievement that you can reach is the state cup. Right? Like that's the biggest. So if you're the champion of New Jersey, you're the champion of New Jersey. And then maybe from there you could do some sort of interregional. You can have those regional tournaments to determine, okay, who's the best of the best, right? Right now you have regional leagues that that end up competing nationally. And if you dispel that, you reduce a lot of the expense cost, right? Or the travel cost. And then I would say, and I'm not sure how to do this. Like you just reduce the number of tournaments that are out there. I probably think you can't do that, but you can still travel for tournaments, go to a tournament, showcase this, showcase that. But the way it works now, you're, at least up here, you're up and down, where I'm at, you're up and down the East Coast. It's funny, nothing ever seems to be good enough in your home state, so you end up traveling to wherever for a tournament. So I think there's ways to reduce it on the periphery and without sort of destroying something that we've had functionally. What I think the big reason for all of this, quite frankly, and it generally pops up, is when you see failure. When you see failure at the men's national team or the women's national team, failure to win or failure to advance or failure to this, like, and then be reminded who you failed to. You got beat by England or you get beat by France, and look how great their model is. They, and I think a lot of that drives that. And that to me there's a lot more fundamental issues. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to pay, but more fundamental issues that I don't think we take into consideration when we do that, right? To me, the model is not the problem. To me, is how we develop our players, if we develop them at all. Right? That to me, if you're going to choose two things to combat, pay to play or player development, to me, the choice is easy, right? You end up, hey, how are we developing? What are we focused in on, right? And is there, have we seen the end of the big, fast, strong model of player development, right? That's where I think our focus is. So, all right. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Injured Time on Pay to Play. This is by no means, for anyone who's watching, I would love to do like a more of a roundtable of folks who agree or disagree, just what they say about opinions. So, but just to give some perspective, some thought, and hopefully this was enlightening to you. From Simple Coach HQ and Jackie, who is still out, greetings to you all. Hope you're enjoying the start of soon-to-be Division III soccer, the soccer season, and we'll talk soon.